Welcome to this special edition of the Iron Will Report. This week I'm bringing you something a little different, for two reasons. One, to be honest, it's been a slow news week, so I've decided to save the few stories of significance for next week's report, and instead bring you an exhaustive special report on the European Union elections. Our globalist would-be overlords are largely concentrated in two places: the United States intelligence community, as was pointed out very clearly by Dr. Robert Malone in my recent interview with him, and in Europe, where the WEF, the WHO, and a number of other globalist-controlled organizations have their head offices in Geneva, which gives them diplomatic immunity. As was explained a few months ago in my interview with Pascal Nejadi, the son of Hussein Nejadi, who co-founded with Klaus Schwab the organization that would become the WEF. Add to this the fact that the European Union is seen by many as a model of what a global government might look like, and you'll understand why the European political climate has a dramatic effect on us here, at the very least serving as an indicator of the plans and fortunes of the globalists. Finally, I will also reveal a sinister Canada-EU-WEF connection. From May 6th to 9th, 700 million Europeans from the 27 EU countries voted to elect their MEPs, or members of the European Parliament, as their representatives in the European Union. Since the election ended last weekend, political analysts and mainstream news sites have been abuzz with announcements of major victories for what they are calling the far right, with leftists bemoaning their loss of power to protect the interests of the downtrodden woke minority, and conservatives celebrating what they see as a clear turning point in Europe's often perceived leftist political environment. But is this an accurate reflection of the political landscape? And why should you care about EU elections? This is Europe, after all, not Canada. Heck, it's not even the US. To understand why the EU elections matter to us here, you must first understand the political structure of the European Union. Fair warning, it's complicated. I'll admit it took me quite some time to understand it. Fortunately, there are ways to simplify it. This diagram shows the full structure. Yikes! But since we're only really concerned with decision-making, we could ignore 4 of the 7 branches of the European Union power structure. It's not that they don't matter, they just don't matter for the purpose of this editorial. What those 700 million Europeans have voted on last week was to elect their representatives in the European Parliament, the aforementioned MEPs. That's the first point of clarity. To say that Europeans voted for their European Union representatives may confuse you, as their representatives are more than just the MEPs. So to avoid confusion, I recommend you think of MEPs as what they are: members of European Parliament, specifically this branch of the European Union right here. Citizens of each country vote to elect their MEPs, and the number of MEPs from each country is determined by the population. Well, mostly. Countries with smaller populations get more MEPs per capita because I actually don't know. It's also important to understand that MEPs are not politicians from the member countries, at least not sitting politicians. While MEP candidates are backed by the various political parties within their countries and are party members, they cannot be in office in their country and serve as an MEP at the same time. So elections for the European Union representatives are entirely separate than elections in each country for federal or state or provincial representatives. Which doesn't mean federal politicians and national political parties don't have influence. In fact, as you'll see, they have a great deal. Political alliances also work differently in the EU. In Canada, we are accustomed to MPs voting as a bloc. At some point early in their political career, it is made clear to freshly minted MPs that they will vote as directed by their party, and that their political career will go down in flames if they don't. But MEPs choose their political party in the EU after they are elected. This is because the EU political parties are different than the national parties the candidates belong to, for the obvious reason that all 27 countries have different parties with different platforms. They run for their party in their own country, then join the EU party whose ideology and goals most closely match the national party to which they belong. So an MEP may be elected under the banner of a conservative party in their country, but when they are elected, They have 3 conservative parties in the EU to choose from. They have to pick one, and there might not be an EU party that exactly reflects the values of the conservative party they belong to back home. This means that sometimes they might vote differently than other members of their EU party. Unlike MPs or MLAs in Canada, MEPs cannot table bills or propose legislation. Only the Commission can do that. Although the MEPs, that is to say, Parliament, do vote on them. Ostensibly, this system avoids corruption, as the people who propose legislation are different than the people who vote on that legislation. Ostensibly. But this is politics. Once they are elected and have chosen which party they will sit with in Parliament, their next task is to elect the government. But wait, aren't they the government? Well, they're part of it. Remember, I said it's complicated. Their first job is to elect from their ranks the President of the European Commission. The Commission is the actual executive body. They propose and implement EU laws and policies which are legally binding upon the member nations. This is important as, unlike the President, who was elected from the ranks of the Parliament by the MEPs, who were in turn elected by the people, the commissioners are appointed by their governments. There are 27 commissioners, 1 for each member country. To say they are appointed is a little misleading. They are nominated by their governments. They have to be approved by the MEPs and the President of the Commission, who, remember, is elected from the MEPs from within their own ranks. Once the commissioners are approved, however, it's easiest to think of them as being like cabinet ministers, except instead of representing a department, they represent a country. And note, too, that while MEPs are elected per capita, so large countries get proportionally more votes, each country only gets 1 commissioner, which means that lowly Malta, with a population of just over 500,000, gets 1 commissioner, the same as Übermensch, Germany, with a population of almost 85 million. The current EU president is Ursula von der Leyen, a German doctor and center-right politician who served in Germany's government under Angela Merkel. Ursula was voted leader of the EPP, or European People's Party. While it's not automatic, usually the MEP who is leader of the largest party is selected as president. As von der Leyen was re-elected as an MEP last week, she may be re-elected as president, but that doesn't seem likely, as while the EPP is still the largest party, Italy now controls more of their seats than Germany does. Confused yet? Stick with me. The point to understand for now is that while the President of the Commission, the executive body, is elected from the ranks of the MEPs, the commissioners are appointed by their respective countries and approved or not by the MEPs. So with the President, the MEPs elect them, but with the commissioners, the MEPs only have the power to reject them, and then only if there's a majority vote against. Remember how I referred earlier to the fact that MPs of political parties in Canada almost always vote as a bloc. This does happen to some extent within the 7 parties of the European Parliament, but the number of votes within a single party that a new bill might get is the result of a number of complicated factors. Very seldom do all members of a party vote the same, due to the fact that they are from different countries and so represent different interests. As an example, the center-right EPP, or European People's Party, and the center-left Socialist and Democrats members usually have about 90% of their MEPs voting with their respective party on any given issue, which is to say, most of the time, if the EPP MEPs voted yay, their political opposites, the S&D MEPs, voted nay. Which just leaves explaining the Council of the EU. The Council is where the governments of the 27 member nations get to have their say on policies proposed by the Commission. There are 27 members of the Council, 1 for each member country, just as with the commissioners. But unlike the MEPs and the commissioners who are not, in fact, cannot be, serving members of the government of their respective nations, councillors are government ministers, 1 from each member state, and appointed by their respective governments with no veto power from the EU Parliament. But it's more complicated than that. Each country actually has multiple commissioners. Who each country sends depends upon what is being decided. For example, when discussing economic and financial affairs, the ECOFIN Council is composed of the finance ministers from each of the 27 member states. Now that you have all of that background information on the structure, we can examine how policies are supposed to be made and how they're really made. The Commission proposes the laws, But before they can be imposed upon the 27 member nations, both the Council, that is, ministers from the governments of each member country, and the Parliament, the elected representatives of the people of each member country, have to approve it by a majority vote. It's a little more complicated than that, but this is enough for us to be getting on with. On the surface, this is all very complex. Under the surface, though, it's politics as usual. Each member country of the EU seeks to have as much influence as possible on legislative votes. To make it even more complex, the individual political parties within each member country are also seeking as much influence as possible. A party might be out of office in their home country and still have a number of MEPs serving in the EU Parliament. If they can swing EU votes that affect their country, then they still have influence. Stripping away then all the European Union Politics 101 stuff, here's how the EU government really works. Member states send commissioners to propose laws beneficial to their country and the ruling political party. Commissioners are party ministers, so while other parties might have MEPs in Parliament, only the ruling party can appoint commissioners. The Commission President is an MEP elected by the MEPs in Parliament, who are ostensibly the people's representatives. But in actual fact, the President is usually the leader of the largest party. Why? Because the largest party will have the greatest number of seats from a single country and therefore control of the most votes. Supposedly, the job of the elected President is to oversee and moderate the appointed commissioners, but in actual fact, successful political maneuvering means the President is an extra voice on the Commission, controlled by the most powerful country and party. Member states also nominate councillors to represent their country and party interests. The councillors are ministers from each country's government, and different ministers are sent depending upon what the EU government is voting on. So the real purpose of the councillors is to block proposed legislations from opposing countries or parties and promote amongst their peers legislations that would benefit their countries. Finally, there's the members of European Parliament, who are elected by the people but represent their own political parties back home. In short, the entire structure is a political deck of cards, and each country and political party seeks to stack the deck in their favor. The corruption is the same, it just takes place on more levels than here in Canada. At the beginning of this report, I alluded to the media claims and conjectures on the significance of a shift in MEPs toward the political right. There are a number of professionally prepared charts online showing the seats graphically, but as you're going to see, these charts don't help much because of how they present the data. Personally, I think this is intentional, to prevent you from seeing what I'm about to show you. Take, for example, this gauge chart, comparing 2019, the last EU election, to this year. In 2019, there were 705 seats. Due to population growth, 5 years later, there are 720 seats. It would have been 751, but remember that Great Britain dropped out of the Union in January 2020. Even after losing all the seats formerly occupied by Great Britain, the total number of seats still went up by 15, driven largely by immigration dramatically increasing the European population. Absolute numbers don't help us much, though, and it's very difficult to do a side-by-side comparison with this kind of chart. Percentages of seats tell us a lot more about the mood of the people and political influence from member governments than absolute numbers. I found this chart, which showed the results of all elections up to 2019 in percentages of seats. On the left is, well, the left. This also includes the Green Party. Yellow is the Renew Europe Party, which claims to be solidly center. Then comes the right, followed by the Independents. This is a better visual representation. Still not great in my opinion, but better. Now we can start to ask if the media narrative makes sense. Mainstream media is painting this election as a major shift toward the far right. But this chart shows that the EU has historically leaned toward the right since its inception. Only in 1989 did the left, including the Greens, hold over 50% of the seats. As you can see, since then, there has been a gradual shift away from the political left, despite the Green Party growing, while the center and the right have remained fairly steady. The right did lose some ground in the last two elections, but they were near their historical high in 2009, so there wasn't really anywhere to go but down. I added to the chart the percentages from this year. Now we can compare all election results since the EU was founded in 1979. We still have a problem, though, in visualizing how this year compares to previous years. See that gap on the right? That's the 52 newly elected MEPs, or 7% of the Parliament, who have not yet declared their party affiliation. They have until the first plenary session on July 16th to do so. With those missing, the bars are misleading. They are shorter than they will be after the new MEPs choose their parties. We can make an assumption that they will distribute roughly in proportion to the size of each party and simply remove the gap, stretching out the other bars to fill in the space. But first, that's a big assumption. And second, with the independents placed on the right side in each election year, most of us will still have a hard time comparing the left and right over the years as the size of the independent group keeps changing. Placing the left, center, right, and independents stacked like this gives a much clearer picture. Now we can see that this year the right does indeed control a much greater percentage of the European Parliament than the left. But we still need to compare this to all previous years to see if this is a significant shift. To do that, we'll need to change the axis. As with the bars horizontal and the years stacked vertically, I can't fit it all on one screen. Just before I add in all previous elections, let's change the scale on the y-axis and top it out at 60%. This will make it easier to compare the differences. Now that we have all the data displayed in a way that's easy and intuitive, we can compare the percentages held by each political party over the years. And if you were to look at this chart for a few minutes, I'm sure you would see what I see. Simply comparing this year to 2019 and saying the right made massive gains this year will be very misleading because we're not seeing any other election years. But when we can see all years, going back to the formation of the Union, it's clear that 2019 was an anomalous year. The Greens that year captured almost twice their usual number of seats, and there was a very significant increase in Central Renew Europe seats as well. These gains by those two parties meant that both the left and right parties in 2019 were down from 2014. Then, this year, the Greens lost almost all of their 2019 gains, while the Renew Europe party also returned to more average historical numbers. But notice where those seats went. The mainstream left parties, shown in red, stayed exactly the same, neither gaining or losing. All those seats went to the conservative right, but only to the extent that it recovered from 2019. While high, it's not the highest it's ever been. That was in 1979. So now we can ask, why? Is this really an attempted hostile takeover by us radical, racist, far-right extremists, as mainstream media claims, or something else? Remember that larger countries have far more influence than smaller ones. Most of the change comes from just 3 countries: Italy, France, and Germany. These 3 together comprise over 45% of Western Europe's population, which means these countries, which either are or are likely to become right-wing, now control a substantial number of votes in the EU Parliament. French President Emmanuel Macron is calling a snap election following a stunning defeat of his left-leaning Renaissance Party, which won only half as many seats as his right-wing opposition, the National Rally. During the pandemic, Macron's government was not only one of the first to impose strict lockdowns, but also stay-at-home orders and vaccine passports for restaurants and travel. During this time, there were multiple instances of heavy-handed policing, kind of like another country we could think of. Emmanuel Macron graduated from the WEF's Young Global Leaders program in 2016, just 1 year before his election as President of France. Gabriel Attal, who became the Prime Minister of France in January of this year, served in several posts in Macron's Renaissance government. Attal graduated from the Young Global Leaders program in 2020. It was much the same story in Germany, where the right-wing Alternative for Germany party soundly defeated the incumbent center-left SPD party. The SPD, or Social Democratic Party, formed a leftist coalition government in 2021, defeating the Christian Democratic Party, which had governed Germany under Chancellor Angela Merkel since 2005, after the CDU proved to be red Tories. During the pandemic, Merkel's government not only imposed lockdowns, but also barred the unvaxxed from public spaces like restaurants, made vaccination for healthcare workers mandatory, and attempted to implement nighttime curfews and mandatory testing. Merkel was also heavily criticized for her open borders immigration policies. Ursula von der Leyen, the current president of the EU Parliament and leader of the EPP, or European People's Party, served in several cabinet positions in Merkel's government and was pegged to be her replacement before the party was defeated. In November of last year, von der Leyen signed a deal with EU Council President Charles Michel and our very own Justin Trudeau to cooperate in creating a global digital ID system aimed at online censorship. Von der Leyen is also a trustee of the World Economic Forum, just like our very own Chrystia Freeland. As a result of such obvious corruption in both Germany and France, Western Europe's two largest countries, the people have chosen to be represented at the EU by parties other than the one they elected to govern their own country, which almost certainly means these parties will be out in the next election. In Italy, where Giuseppe Conte was prime minister until his resignation in February of 2021, the media was falsely reporting hundreds of thousands of COVID deaths. Conte was the first European leader to impose lockdowns and has since been investigated by government prosecutors on suspicion of aggravated culpable pandemic and manslaughter. In 2022, Giorgia Meloni was elected as prime minister. Openly Christian and unapologetically conservative, Meloni has at least attempted to curb rampant immigration and has promised that Italy will never again violate the people's rights with knockdowns. Not surprisingly, the leftist media threw a fit when she was elected. It was Meloni's Brother of Italy party which garnered the most seats in the EU's EPP party, of which Ursula von der Leyen is currently the president. Now, with Meloni's influence, it is highly likely von der Leyen will be replaced. All of the aforementioned scandals and corruptions in the EU's three largest Western European countries happened shortly before, during, or shortly after 2019, the year of the last EU Parliament election, the year in which both the Greens and the supposedly center-right EPP party under WEF agent Ursula von der Leyen gained the largest number of seats they had ever held since the EU was formed in 2019, and by a wide margin. And what else happened in 2019? Oh yes, the globalists launched a plandemic in an effort to steal all of our rights and freedoms. A plandemic which required, in Europe and around the world, cooperative governments to feed the narrative and violate the rights of the people. And why 2019? Not just because they had their bioweapon ready and control of the media, but also because they had spent years putting in place around the world politicians they controlled. So the election results from last week are not a far-right militant plot to take over the European Union, as the globalist-controlled media wants people to believe, but rather a return to historically normal numbers of seats by party as the people take back their governments. Governments which had been captured by globalist influence to place their own agents in positions to promote their narrative and advance their agenda. Now that globalist control is waning, their power to influence elections and policies is slipping away. In a desperate attempt to salvage what influence they still can, they've instructed their media propaganda agents to convince the masses of a dangerous neo-Nazi white supremacist uprising, aiming to stage a coup of their carefully constructed and oh-so-inclusive leftist government. They can't let that happen. Why, democracy might break out. That is all for this week's special edition of the Iron Will Report. In interviews coming out this week. On Sunday, financial expert Peter J. Merrick on the Trudeau government's most recent budget. Peter read the entire 438-page budget released just a few weeks ago by Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland. In this interview, Peter discloses the taxes in the budget that the government didn't want you to know about. We also discuss the question of why Trudeau's government is intentionally shipwrecking our economy. Then on Wednesday, the second quarter economy update from our team of financial experts. Adrian Spitters, a financial consultant who correctly predicted the 2008 crash, and Bryce Wade and Warren Keane from New World Precious Metals. The signs continue to show that a global economic collapse on a scale never seen before is coming, and how to protect your assets, yourself, and your family.